Good morning. It's very easy to answer that question. In my considered view, something we're still in the corner. We haven't fully turned yet, and I'll explain that with some of the indicators. Right, we cannot deny that there has been some positive signs of recovery, quote and unquote, and it's quite important we understand that. But the frame of reference in terms of some of these relative positive signs is just what's happened in the last couple of weeks and months. But that does not in any way indicate whatsoever that we have fully turned the corner as yet. In other words, when you look at some of the indicators that the government set for itself in the 2023 budget, which was read in November of last year, and you compare that to what the projections are for this year, clearly you see that there are issues. Because if we had turned the corner, the question then would have been, why are we then revising all these macroeconomic numbers and indicators down from what we said we'll be doing ourselves? So let's start with the positives, and then we'll address the other substantive issues. Yes, if you look at GDP growth on the quarterly basis, the number that we have for the first quarter of the year is up 4.2% versus 3% of last quarter. If you look at the reserves, which is one of the big issues with CD and the depreciation, the net international reserves was 0.6 months, basically 2 weeks of import cover as of December last year. That's how dire the situation was. And it's been reported now that it's now gone up to 1.1 months of import cover.
So that's 3 weeks, right?
No, that's 1.1 months. So that's 1 month and a couple of days on top of that. So we've been able to add some buffer, more or less, to that. If you look at the primary balance, so the primary balance is your revenue and expenditure, but you don't include your interest payments in that. If you look at that, the report shows that we have a surplus of 1.1% of GDP versus an original target of 0.04%. And there's public debt and all of that. So these are positive indicators. We acknowledge that. But you have to do a holistic analysis using the entire budget number of 2023 as the frame of reference. And if you use that as a frame of reference, it is difficult to sustain then the argument that we have turned the corner. Because the indicators show very clearly that we have made major adjustments and cuts to a lot of these numbers. Take inflation, for argument's sake. In the original policy target, inflation should be between 6 and 10%. Inflation now is in excess of 42%, right? And it's sticky. It's not coming down anytime soon. So you cannot then, on the basis of that, say, because the inflation is 40 or so percent and it's been relatively stable around that mark, we have turned the corner. That argument doesn't wash. Take the exchange rate, CD, again, right? The CD has been trading around 11 or so for some time now. However, if you do the depreciation and you work out the number, right, from the beginning of the year, it is very clear. You're talking almost 22, 23% depreciation year to date. So again, it's difficult to sustain that argument of having turned the corner. The indicators are positive, but we are still largely in the corner and we have not turned in that regard. Lastly, if you look at the budget itself, the media budget that the government presented, and you look at the numbers that the government is highlighting in the media budget and what they intend to do, I find it a bit difficult to even accept some of the cuts that are being proposed. Because again, my frame of reference is 2022 in the budget. In the 2022 budget, if you look at there's a table in the media budget, table 6. If you look at the adjustments that the government said. In the mid-year, or in the original budget, sorry, the government said that they were going to be doing a revenue of 100.5 billion Ghana cedis. So this is the budget that was read in November of 2021.
All right.
And they were going to be doing an expenditure of 135.6, so roughly 136 billion Ghana cedis. Right? And that then means that you had a balance or a deficit of 35 billion that had to be financed. In mid-year, they came to Parliament. So this is Russia-Ukraine happens, June, come to Parliament and say that, well, we're going to be doing now a revenue of about 97 billion and an expenditure of 134 billion, right? And that reflected a cut, particularly on the expenditure side, of going down from 27 or so percent of GDP to about 23% of GDP. This is all in the numbers that the government presented.
Right.
Table 3, Table 5, Table 6 of the mid-year budget. Now see what happens. So we get to the end of the year, and the revenue is still within the ballpark. It's about 96 billion, the provisional item. But watch the expenditure. The expenditure now jumps from 138 to 165 billion. And if you look at how that is going to be financed, from the budget line items, the original budget that was presented in 2022, in 2021 for 2022, there was not going to be any financing of the deficit from Bank of Ghana. It was zero. A lot of the deficit financing was going to come from the commercial banks and other non-banks. There was about 27 billion of deficit financing. Now, watch what happens. At the end of the year in 2022, the financing now jumps from 37 billion now to 65 billion. And out of this 65 billion, 55 billion of that is financed domestically. And within this 55 billion that is financed domestically, the Bank of Ghana pushes as much as 53 billion Ghana cedis into the economy and to support the government's fiscal objectives, even against the ceilings that the Bank of Ghana Act Access 1-2 as amended by 918. And all of this money and the excess deficit spending basically ends up going to drive a large part of the inflation that we see in the latter part of the year. So when now the argument is made that, we have turned the corner, the evidence doesn't really support that case, because your frame of reference ought to be what you indicated and said in the budget, the 2022 budget, not what we are seeing in terms of the relative stability that we're seeing here. And I'm sure we'll come to the whole Bank of Ghana argument and all of that.
Right.
But it is very clear, at least on the surface, when you look at the data and the numbers, that we are not out of the woods yet.
Dr. Theo Acheampong, well, you wanted us to get here first. So what's your take on this matter of the BOG recording a 60.8 billion loss in 2022? And my question that I asked, I need some explaining. Help me appreciate it.
Yeah, so the two issues are interlinked. Let me pick from where Honorable Adongo just left off with the fiscal dominance issue. And it's very important that we understand what has happened within the public finances of this country over the last 2 or so years, right? So originally, like I had highlighted, when that 2023 budget was read in November of 2021, the idea was that you're going to have a 37 billion Ghana financing deficit. And of this 37 billion, the Bank of Ghana was not going to be involved anyway in financing that deficit. The line item there in Table 6 of the mid-year budget is zero. It's there. You can see, I think I provided some some charts to your colleagues to put
Yeah,
on
we
the
have seen
screen.
it. We have seen it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Then, even as of the mid-year when we came, the amount had moved just a little bit. So there was a 38 billion gap. Out of that 38 billion, 28 billion was coming from domestic sources. Of the 28, 8 billion was going to come from Bank of Ghana, right? Something happens from July to December that forces the bank now to lend even in excess of what the appropriations were during the mid-year budget, thereby, in my view, even breaching the provisions of the Bank of Ghana Act and the Public Financial Management Act, as Honorable Adongo and others have spoken about. So if you look at the number, 55 billion was the financing from domestic sources. And Bank of Ghana pushes or pumps in 53 billion as part of this here, right? So if you work the number out, that's over 90% of that, or as a proportion of your total financing, 85%. So 85 CDs of every 100 CDs that came in to finance the deficit in 2022 came largely from the central bank because Ghana was locked out of the capital markets. There were the issues even with the domestic market and all of that. But it goes to the point that Honorable Adongo and others have all argued out, right? That there is an overdominance of the fiscal side of things that in a way even pushes or compromises, in my view, the independence of the central bank. Because you look at the central bank and their core mandate is twofold in Axis 1-2. The first one says they've got to fight or address inflation, so price stability. And then the second is something related to supporting general government policy and related matters, right? Where they can give overdrafts and loans and things like that. But in the amended section 3, 1A of Axis 1, it says that except as provided in this constitution, the Bank of Ghana, in the performance of its function under this act, shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority. This is explicitly stated in the act. And you look at the people that sit on the board of the central bank in section 4 of the amendments, right? From the governor, the deputy governors, all the way to the 9 other directors, these are all appointed by the president, right? So you begin to see the conundrum where the central bank is basically being used to finance the deficit and has become the piggy bank of the state, to the point that the original mandate of the central bank, which is to fight inflation, we've lost that battle, right? The policy target, they said, not me, they were going to do between 6 and 10% inflation, right? As we speak now, it's in excess of 40. Even the target now this year is not going, the provision or the forecast is that it will come down to about 30. But inflation is still sticky. So there's a mismatch between the policy making environment. It comes down to the fact that you've got, the state pretty much on the fiscal side of things dominating everything.
All right.
And that has led to a compromise on the central bank's, own ability to meet the core mandates of that.
All right.
And I think there are issues there that we need to, again, for me, legally, we need to interrogate because Honorable Adongo maybe can speak to this. If you look at Section 30 of the Act, right, again, it says that you cannot borrow or lend more than 5% of the previous year's revenue. But in 36, it says that in the event of an emergency, the governor, the minister, the controller, and accountant general shall meet to decide the limit on the borrowing. That should be made by the government. And number 2, the minister shall submit a report on the issue to Parliament within 7 sitting days. Question is, did this meeting take place? Number 2, was that report ever submitted to Parliament? Same thing in the amendment of the Act. It says section 16(7) says that where the loans, advances, and purchases of treasury bill securities is 5%, so when you have hit that target of the previous year's revenue, the governor shall notify the minister, so that's the Minister of Finance, and Parliament in attainment of the limit under subsection 2, and the minister, upon notification, shall again report to Parliament on the remedial measures that are meant to be taken. This is in the Act. That's it.
And all of this have not been done. Interesting. All of this have not been done. Interesting.